In the heart of Chicago lies a prison so vast, so overcrowded, its walls whisper thousands of stories of failure, chaos, and broken systems. This is America's biggest jail, with the biggest security holes. Before we dive in, if you're fascinated by true crime, prison systems, and institutional failures, hit subscribe now so you don't miss any chapter of this story. Pause. Let's begin. The sprawling complex of Cook County Jail sits on roughly 96 acres on the west side of Chicago, Illinois. It is operated by the Cook County Sheriff's Office, and over decades has become what many correction system watchdogs call a glaring symbol of overcrowding, under-resourcing, and systemic risk. Rather than being a modest county lockup, this is a mega facility, historically one of the largest single-site county jails in the United States. From the moment an individual enters the gates, whether pretrial detainee or sentenced inmate, the system is under strain. The large volume of people circulating, the staff shortages, the aging infrastructure, they all contribute to what many regard as major security holes. Take, for instance, the federal investigation conducted by the U.S. Department of Justice in 2008. The investigation concluded that the jail systematically violates inmates' federal constitutional rights. According to the DOJ's letter, the jail failed to adequately protect inmates from harm, failed to provide adequate medical and mental health care, failed to provide safe and sanitary living conditions, and more. Those are serious structural failures. They are not simply the result of one bad shift or a rogue officer. They point to systemic vulnerabilities. We'll explore how those vulnerabilities manifest in very real ways: escapes or near escapes, transport incidents, understaffed shifts, inmates with violent histories being moved improperly, and how the system's size and complexity make oversight difficult. The sheer size brings its own risks. When a facility holds thousands of people, many of them awaiting trial, many with uncertain status, managing movement, tracking behavior, monitoring security becomes exponentially harder. Documents show that at Cook County Jail there are thousands of admissions annually, and hundreds if not more detainees cycling in and out. For example, observers in the Criminal Justice Committee of the Cook County Board noted that 40,000 people per year cycle through the Cook County jail system. That is a massive churn. With that many people coming in and out, sometimes quickly, sometimes staying longer, classification errors can happen, security risk assessments slip, and oversight can be overwhelmed. When you add to that the fact that, according to the 2008 DOJ findings, the jail was failing in key protective duties, you begin to see how the giant aspect is not just physical size but institutional size. The bigger the system, the more potential points of failure. Structural and environmental failures. Some of the documented problems are shocking. Overcrowded cells, people forced to sleep on floors, rodent and pest infestation, poor sanitation, inadequate fire safety and environmental conditions. When the environment itself becomes unsafe, security isn't just about locks and cameras, it's about the baseline stability of the facility. If inmates are in constant crisis or if the physical plant is falling apart, those situations become security risks. Fights start, staff tensions rise, the capacity to respond drops. In the next chapter we'll zoom in on one major locus of failure: transport and movement of inmates, a phase rife with risk and one where Cook County Jail repeatedly mishandled high-risk individuals. One of the most vulnerable times for any jail system is when inmates are moved, from housing units to court, from one facility to another, during transport to external hearings. Movement means potential for escape, assault, fights, weapon smuggling, loss of supervision. At the massive operations of Cook County Jail, numerous cases have exposed glaring security holes tied to inmate movement. A particularly illustrative example: the high-risk movement protocol at Cook County. According to jail policy, inmates with known histories of violence or fights should be transported under increased security, perhaps in separate vehicles with additional officers or under tighter restraints. However, internal data analyzed by media revealed that many inmates who triggered those criteria were still transported in regular buses, together with other inmates, often resulting in fights. For example, one inmate identified as Surat, in the publicly reported data, had already been in multiple fights inside the jail before being transported on a bus, unsegregated. He then fought on the bus. The policy should have flagged him for high-risk movement, but the jail did not apply that. The data showed that at least 18 inmates had been in at least 3 fights inside the jail before being transported on buses and then got into further fights during bus transport. One victim, named in the report as 22-year-old Kamanti Kaj, was handcuffed and on a bus when he was attacked by another inmate who had escaped his restraints. Kaj said, "I couldn't even do nothing." These are not minor slip-ups. They reveal a system in which known risks are not always mitigated. Inmates with history of violent incidents should have triggered further safeguards, yet they were being transported alongside non-violent detainees or in regular vehicles without heightened security. Why does this matter so much? Because when the movement phase fails, it can cascade. An assault during transport can lead to medical emergencies, lawsuits, increased cost for the county, injured staff, longer litigation, reputational damage. The media report notes that the jail spent nearly $90 million on medical care for inmates in 1 year, though they could not isolate how much of that was from bus transport injuries. Transport is also when oversight is weakest. Fewer staff, longer distances outside the main facility, more variables, more opportunities for weapons or contraband. If the policy that should mitigate these risks isn't enforced, the holes widen. The paradox of size again. Because Cook County Jail is so large, moving hundreds or thousands of inmates to court hearings, external transport becomes a massive logistical challenge. Mistakes that might happen in a smaller facility become magnified here. Staff shortages, budget constraints, scheduling complexity make it so that corners get cut, high-risk individuals get lumped in standard transport, or insufficient supervision occurs. Critics say that the manpower is unbelievable for that short 20-second court appearance, in the media quote. If thousands of detainees move each week and only a limited number of officers are available, the question is, are the risky ones properly segregated? Do they get proper supervision? And is there enough redundancy in the system so that one failure doesn't trigger a cascade? The answer appears to be, not always. Consequences and real-world outcomes. When the transport system fails, the consequences are real and sometimes serious. Fights, injuries, medical bills, lawsuits, and ultimately risk to public safety, e.g. when violence breaks out en route. In one case, an inmate with 17 previous fights inside the jail attacked another inmate on a bus and sent his victim to the emergency room. That inmate should never have been on that bus under known policy. From a security standpoint, this indicates a glaring hole. A known violent actor was allowed to be transported like any other, no separate vehicle, no extra staffing. From a management standpoint, it shows how policy is only as strong as its enforcement. The policy existed but was not fully applied. From a system design perspective, the massive throughput and complexity of the jail make movement a vulnerable phase. And in this jail it is being exploited, or rather, slipping through. In the next chapter we will examine inmate conditions inside the facility. How overcrowding, sanitation, pest problems and poor health care contribute to insecurity and risk, turning a jail from a locked fortress into a brittle structure with multiple weak points. Inside the walls of Cook County Jail, the environment itself becomes a key part of the security picture. Security is not just about bars and guards, it's about how sustainable the operations are, how safe the living conditions are, how much the system is stretched. And here, the facility has documented failures. One of the landmark documents is again the 2008 letter from the U.S. Department of Justice, which found, the facility has failed to provide conditions of confinement that do not offend the Constitution and take reasonable measures to protect inmates from harm. That's powerful wording. A large jail, operating in the modern era, found to be systematically failing its core obligations. Some of the specifics. Forced sleeping on cell floors due to overcrowding, rodent infestation and injury from rats and mice, food and sanitation problems, medical delays, inadequate fire safety, inadequate suicide prevention, inadequate mental health care. When the living conditions are compromised, security becomes harder in all dimensions. Overcrowding and constant churn. The massive annual admissions, large population and pretrial detainees combine to produce a high-throughput environment. The Criminal Justice Committee Observer reports note that the jail serves 40,000 individuals per year. In such an environment, many inmates may only be in the facility for short durations, others for long durations. That flux increases classification errors and management difficulties. Overcrowding leads to cells filled beyond capacity, more people in smaller spaces, more stress, more potential for conflict, which in turn increases security risk. When you have infestations, when you have people sleeping on floors, when sanitation is poor, you have conditions that can facilitate fight behavior, mental health crises, desperate acts, or situations where staff are stretched thin and can't monitor effectively. Health, mental health and staff stress. The environment of a facility under strain is one where mental health needs escalate. Detainees awaiting trial, many with substance abuse issues or behavioral issues, combined with delays, anxiety, crowded spaces. This leads to higher incidents of self-harm, violence, panic, and medical crises. The DOJ report flagged the jail's failure to provide adequate suicide prevention. When mental health care is deficient, Inmates with crises can become security risks, either to themselves or others. Staff in such environments are under tremendous strain. Handling large volumes, high turnover, large numbers of detainees with special needs, limited resources. When staff are pushed to the limit, monitoring and supervision slip and security holes grow. Environment meets security holes. When you combine deficient living conditions with movement failures from Chapter 2 and massive size Chapter 1, a picture emerges. The environment itself is a vulnerability. For example, pest infestations may not seem like security in the conventional sense, but consider this. Rats bite sleeping inmates, meaning injuries, legal claims, medical care, and instability. The DOJ report cited injuries from rodent bites. That means added cost, added litigation, added strain. Inmates sleeping on floors because no beds are available. That means less separation, more proximity, more risk of fights. Poor sanitation, more illness, more stress, more security challenges. Delayed medical care means some inmates deteriorate, become disruptive, or become medical emergencies, requiring diversion of staff from security tasks. Fire safety lapses, flooding, broken infrastructure. Each of these is a potential security hole. If a cell block floods or a door malfunctions, you have a sudden risk of escape attempt or dangerous situation. The DOJ report explicitly cited inadequate fire safety precautions. So when we talk about security holes in Cook County Jail, these go beyond missing locks or cameras. They include systemic vulnerabilities, flawed policy implementation, understaffing, aged infrastructure, poor living conditions, and movement/transport weaknesses. The human cost. Beyond the abstract, there is a human cost. Detainees going through hellish conditions, lawyers filing class action suits, inmates injured by fellow inmates or by staff, staff being overworked and at risk of moral injury, taxpayers paying for repairs, litigation, medical bills. For example, the DOJ letter mentions settlements from inmates forced to sleep on floors, and from others subject to invasive strip searches, or with delays in discharge after bond paid, each a factor that affects trust in the system and magnifies risk. Security isn't just about preventing escapes, it's about creating a stable milieu where monitoring works, policy is enforced, supervision possible, movement controlled, and the living environment is safe enough that the day-to-day prison operations don't collapse into chaos. In the next chapter we'll explore one of the most striking vulnerabilities, staff shortages, labor disruptions, and how they magnify the security holes in a facility this size. One of the most underappreciated factors in prison security is staffing. How many officers are present, how many shifts covered, how many outs for sickness, vacations, resignations, and how labor unrest or staffing shortages create moments when security is weaker. At Cook County Jail, the size of the facility means that any disruption resonates deeply. Consider a shocking incident. On Mother's Day in 2017, more than 500 correctional officers failed to show up for their shifts, including over 200 for the day shift. The result? The facility went into lockdown. Now, imagine a transport day or a court movement day, or a shift change with fewer staff and large numbers of detainees still needing supervision. The risk multiplies. The fact the facility is so large means that it needs a large number of officers just to hold standard operations. If there is a mass call-out or a strike or mass sick leave, the margin for error vanishes. One or two missing officers may not sink a small jail, but in a facility like Cook County's, missing 100 plus can plunge operations into crisis. During such times, the security holes we've discussed, movement risks, poor living conditions, transport vulnerabilities, become even more dangerous. Without sufficient staff, the monitoring of high-risk individuals falls off, classification may lag, response times slow, and blind spots widen. Recruitment, retention, and morale. Large jails across the U.S. face staff turnover, recruitment lags, budget constraints. Officers may be less experienced, less trained, or stretched overtime. When staff morale is low, corners may be cut. Fewer cell checks, less movement supervision, less thorough searches, delayed incident logging. Cook County, with its size and legacy issues, is especially vulnerable. The environment is challenging, the inmate population large, the supervision intense. If staff retention is weak, you end up with many newer officers who may lack the institutional knowledge or routinized procedures. And when staffing is low, supervisory structure may collapse. Fewer sergeants, fewer mid-level supervisors, meaning that when an incident begins, early intervention may fail, escalation may happen faster. Budget and resource constraints. Security is expensive. Good staff, modern infrastructure, cameras, surveillance systems, transport vehicles, high-risk movement protocols, training, mental health staff, medical staff. In a facility already marked by decades of under-resourcing, see DOJ findings, the tension between budget and risk is always present. The combination of high throughput and limited budgets means that decision-makers are constantly weighing cost against security risk. Some decisions may favor, just get them in, just transfer them, just move them rather than delay and classify but wait for resources. That creates holes. For example, as we saw in Chapter 2, when high-risk inmates were still transported on regular buses, clearly not enough resources were deployed to segregate them or afford extra supervision. That decision is not purely mismanagement, it's resource-driven. In other words, staffing and resource constraints create the preconditions for security holes. When disruption meets risk, day-to-day examples. Imagine a day where multiple court transports must happen. Several officers call out sick. The facility is running short. High-risk inmates are loaded onto a bus with others because the extra vehicle and extra officers aren't available. Somewhere a fight breaks out. Someone gets injured. Medical attention is needed. Staff diverted. A lawsuit begins. Or consider a shift where cell block checks are delayed because one housing unit has only one guard instead of two. That guard is isolated, intervention is slower, an inmate on the floor bleeds out or a fight escalates. These operational cracks are exactly where security holes open. At Cook County Jail, the combination of size, high throughput, known risk populations, and documented historic failures mean that staffing disruptions are not just inconvenience, they are potential tipping points. What this means for oversight and management. When a facility is big and complex, oversight becomes harder. The chain of command is longer, more units exist, more employees to train, more nuance in procedures. Staff training may vary. Some areas of the jail, older wings, may have more structural problems. Some units may have more violent inmates. Standardizing performance across such a facility is difficult. When you overlay low staffing, turnover, resource pressures, and a constant flood of new inmates, you get a system that is always playing catch-up rather than being proactive. And that reactive mode is precisely what allows security holes to persist. In most jails, security conjures images of bars, cuffs, cameras, guards. But inside Cook County Jail, one of the most devastating and least expected security failures didn't come from an inmate with a shank. It came from a virus. When COVID-19 swept across the United States in 2020, Cook County Jail became one of the nation's largest COVID hotspots. For a time, it had more confirmed cases than many entire states. Public health researchers flagged it as a major driver of Chicago's early outbreak, calling it a viral amplifier, meaning the disease didn't just spread inside the jail, it spilled into the surrounding community when staff went home each day. This wasn't just a health crisis, it exposed the jail's deep structural weaknesses in surveillance, containment, and systemic stability. And it showed that the biggest security holes in America's biggest jail weren't always made of metal or glass. Sometimes they were invisible. A system too big to control. Cook County Jail holds thousands of detainees and employs thousands of staff members. That constant rotation, guards entering and exiting daily, detainees going to court or receiving medical care, turned the facility into a superconductive environment for viral transmission. Researchers from several universities later published studies showing that the jail's outbreak had a direct and measurable impact on Chicago's wider COVID case numbers, especially during the early months of 2020. The jail essentially became a hub. A virus would spread inside, then staff and visitors unwittingly carried it outward. Inside the walls, conditions magnified the danger. Dorm-style housing units, shared air systems, overcrowded cells, and poor sanitation all collided with a virus that thrived on proximity. Remember, the DOJ had already found severe sanitation problems in the facility long before the pandemic ever arrived. Add a fast-spreading pathogen into that environment? The outcome was almost pre-written. Staff shortages turned deadly. Pandemics don't care about staffing levels, but staffing levels absolutely determine how well a facility responds to a pandemic. Inside Cook County Jail, officers began calling out sick in large numbers. Quarantine protocols sidelined many more. Essential posts were left thin or abandoned. And the jail's size meant the fallout was multiplied. A small lockup can limp along during a crisis. Cook County Jail? Lose a few dozen officers and entire housing units become unsupervised. Lose a few hundred and daily operations collapse. This forced administrators to shuffle personnel, consolidate units, and rely on emergency measures. Every time inmates were moved for medical evaluation, new security risks emerged. Every time officers rotated posts to cover shortages, blind spots appeared. The virus wasn't just overwhelming the medical side, it was eroding the security infrastructure itself. Human toll, systemic exposure. As the outbreak worsened, detainees reported terrifying conditions. Cells where sick and healthy inmates were mixed. Delayed testing. Limited access to PPE. Chaotic medical response. Conflicting instructions from staff. Family members protested outside the facility, demanding the release of vulnerable detainees. Civil rights lawyers filed emergency motions. Public health experts rang alarm bells. Media called it a disaster inside America's largest jail. And behind the chaos was a clear truth. The jail was simply too large, too overcrowded, and too structurally flawed to contain a virus effectively. This is where the security angle becomes undeniable, because when disease spreads unchecked in a detention environment, violence tends to follow. Tensions rose. Fights increased. Fear sparked incidents. Inmates begged for medical attention. Others turned desperate. Officers, fearing for their own safety, tightened restrictions and increased use of force reports. The outbreak made the jail unstable, unpredictable, and more dangerous, for inmates, for staff, and for the city beyond the walls. Containment measures that created new risks. Administrators attempted mitigation strategies. Mass testing, quarantine tiers, staggered movement schedules, modified meal service, reduced visitation. But every measure introduced new layers of security friction. Quarantine units meant moving inmates more often. Staggered movement meant fewer officers supervising more simultaneous tasks. Medical isolation meant more blind hallways and less line-of-sight coverage. Closing visitation meant cutting off one of the few stabilizing forces in inmates' lives: emotional contact with loved ones. Even when these protective measures worked medically, they sometimes destabilized housing units, increased stress, and contributed to unrest. What the outbreak revealed: the pandemic didn't create security holes at Cook County Jail, it exposed the ones already there, widening them until they were impossible to ignore. Overcrowding makes disease spread faster. Poor sanitation makes containment harder. Staff shortages weaken both security and medical response. High turnover increases procedural mistakes. Aging infrastructure limits isolation capacity. Mass movement of detainees multiplies infection risk. Large-scale operations mean small problems scale into disasters. The outbreak became a case study for how a jail can influence, and be influenced by, public health on a citywide scale. It also demonstrated how health security is inseparable from physical security. When a virus overruns a jail, it compromises supervision, inflames tensions, disrupts operations, and undermines every other security protocol. The bigger picture. Cook County Jail isn't just a facility, it's a system unto itself. And in 2020, that system faltered. Not because the virus was uniquely powerful, but because the vulnerabilities were already there. Invisible cracks waiting for the perfect storm. For a place as massive and fortified as Cook County Jail, the words, escape attempt, feel like something that should almost never happen. This is a jail with layers of fencing, surveillance, high walls, checkpoints, and a small army of correctional officers. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Cook County Jail has seen multiple escape attempts, near escapes, and moments where inmates got far closer to freedom than the public ever imagined. And each incident wasn't just a fluke, it was a symptom of deep structural cracks. The 2017 escape attempt, a sign of bigger problems. One of the most publicized events occurred in 2017, when two detainees, both facing serious charges, made a bold attempt to slip out of Division 9, one of the most secure units in the entire jail. Division 9 is supposed to house high-risk inmates, gang members, and those with violent histories. It's the spot where escape is considered practically impossible. Yet these two men found weaknesses. Security footage revealed they'd tampered with their cell's ventilation grates, prying at metal over time, testing guard response patterns, and exploiting understaffed shifts. The plan wasn't fully completed, but it got far enough to trigger a full internal investigation. If they had succeeded, they would have escaped into an exterior corridor that led dangerously close to the jail's perimeter. For a facility meant to be ironclad, this was a wake-up call. High-risk inmates were able to manipulate infrastructure long enough to test an escape route. A jail too big to watch. One of the major issues identified after the incident was blind spots, in both surveillance systems and manpower. Cook County Jail has dozens of buildings, hundreds of corridors, and thousands of cells. Some areas have old camera systems. Others have angles modern facilities would consider unacceptable. Staff sometimes rely on physical checks, which are only as reliable as the officers assigned to them, and Cook County has constantly struggled with staffing shortages. In a complex this enormous, it's shockingly easy for inmates to take advantage of slow response times or miscommunication between units. That's how plots begin. That's how tools get accumulated. That's how cell modifications happen. And in a jail where maintenance is perpetually backlogged, where broken fixtures can sit unattended and aging hardware creaks under decades of use, a small vulnerability can become a serious danger. The 2013 bold disguise attempt. One of the more shocking escape attempts came when a detainee simply tried to walk out the front door. In 2013, a man facing serious charges managed to swap part of his uniform with another inmate who was scheduled for release. The plan was simple: blending in with released detainees, slipping into the processing line, walking out into the public release area. And it nearly worked. He got as far as the outside processing zone before staff realized the discrepancy. This wasn't an Ocean's 11 scheme. It was basic human error exploitation, enabled by rushed release processing, overwhelmed staff, and the constant churn of hundreds of detainees leaving every week. In plain sight, the perimeter breach that should never have happened. Cook County Jail's perimeter is notoriously complex. Fences, barbed wire, razor coils, controlled gates, watchtowers. But even with all this, one detainee in the 2000s managed to reach the outer perimeter fence of the facility during recreation time. Oh, because a gate was unsecured. A single gate. One mistake. One oversight. He ran. He scaled a secondary barrier. He crossed a yard that should have been fully supervised. He was caught only because a responding officer spotted movement where movement wasn't expected, not because alarms or cameras triggered. Incidents like this underscore a theme. The jail's size creates so many access points, gates, doors, units, and checkpoints that a single point of human failure widens instantly into a dangerous opportunity. Tools, contraband, and the problem of internal blind spots. Another security challenge. Cook County Jail has historically struggled with contraband, especially tools. This includes metal pieces from broken infrastructure, items smuggled through intake, tools diverted from trustee work crews, makeshift tools created from everyday objects. When you combine a massive facility, understaffed shifts, and aging infrastructure, inmates have more opportunity to scavenge materials that can be fashioned into escape aids, prying grates, removing screws, digging into drywall, modifying vents. The 2017 vent tampering plot wasn't unique. It was simply the most public example of a long-standing issue. Why these escape attempts matter. Cook County Jail doesn't have frequent full-blown escapes, thankfully. But the attempts tell a story, and it's not a reassuring one. Inmates have learned where the blind spots are. They understand weak points in surveillance. They've learned guard patterns on understaffed days. They exploit slow maintenance response. They manipulate overcrowded release processing. They observe how chaos, noise, and movement can hide their actions. A facility this size isn't easy to fully secure, and inmates inside are always watching, always waiting, always testing. And when escape attempts happen at the largest jail in America, they don't just represent inmate ingenuity, they represent vulnerabilities large enough to risk public safety. As we've peeled back the layers of Cook County Jail, one thing becomes clear. This place isn't just a detention center, it's a mirror. A mirror reflecting the cracks in America's justice system, the consequences of decades of underfunding, the weight of impossible caseloads, and the human cost of institutional failure. From overcrowding that turns dorms into pressure cookers, to transport protocols that put victims and aggressors inches apart, to outbreaks that exposed invisible threats, to escape attempts that almost rewrote headlines. Cook County Jail stands as a warning. When a system is too big to manage, it's big enough to fail. But if you've stayed with me through all these chapters, through the chaos, the tension, the near escapes and breakdowns, you're exactly the kind of person who knows that these stories matter. Not because they're sensational, but because they're real. Because behind every statistic is a human being. And behind every security hole is a lesson waiting to be learned, or ignored. So before you go, do me a huge favor. If this deep dive opened your eyes, hit subscribe, smash that like button, and drop a comment telling me which part shocked you the most. It helps the channel more than you know. And it makes sure you don't miss our next investigation into the places where the system breaks down, and the people caught inside it. Thanks for watching. Stay curious, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.